Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to talk about first aid. Now this is a topic I've been avoiding a little bit since starting the channel, but actually it's something I do know something about. Adventure bike riding, off-road riding, it really is a steep learning curve. But in terms of first aid and medical care, it is one of my areas that I do know something about. So I know this is always going to be controversial. People are going to have very different opinions. But what I'd like to do is give you my spin and my take on medical care in remote places and how we do that. So I think it's really important to say how I'm qualified to talk about this. There are lots of experts on YouTube and online. So I've been a doctor for about 2.5 decades. I've worked in lots of different specialties, but in recent years, well, over the last sort of decade or two, I've done a lot of work in remote medicine, expedition medicine, and also pre-hospital care and ambulance medicine. I currently work with the ambulance service as an immediate care doctor, so I do respond to a lot of emergencies involving trauma, medical emergencies, and especially road traffic collisions and motorcyclists. I also work on the search and rescue lifeboats as a navigator, but I also do all the medicine on there. So I've done lots of medicine in really nasty remote places, including the middle of the ocean, bottom of cliffs, anywhere you like. So it's about how we translate that first aid and that medicine into these more challenging environments and about what we need to do that. I've also done a lot of work on medical kits. So medical kits range from everything I carry in my car for pre-hospital care, which is pretty much a boot or a trunk if you're from the US, a boot full of gear. And that's a lot of equipment, and that's designed to deal with most life-threatening emergencies. And that comes right across the spectrum to the first aid kits that most of us will carry when we travel, when we go on our bikes. And between that, we've got lots of different equipment, lots of different opinions about what we should carry and how we should use it. So what I'd like to do today is look into what I carry, so what I've decided to carry on my bike. But this is just for day trips out and possibly an overnighter. It's not for an extended expedition where you might need more medicines and more equipment, but actually there's always that compromise between weight and what is absolutely essential, and that's the difficult compromise to make. When you look at a lot of videos online about first aid kits and remote medical care, people get really carried away about getting all the Gucci stuff, all the equipment, and they end up with these massive bags of gear, which in reality you're hardly ever going to use, if ever. So you're just going to carry this weight around. So what is it that actually makes the difference to medical care for patients when bad stuff happens out in remote places, and in particular when we're dealing with motorcycles in remote environments? The first important thing to do is to think about what type of things we might encounter, and it's good to divide these into immediately life-threatening, things that are time critical and could be life-threatening, and more minor injury and illness. So if we look at the immediately life-threatening, there aren't actually very many of those, and they really come down to lack of oxygen and lack of blood. So if somebody is not ventilating their lungs well enough, they're not getting enough oxygen to their brain and to their organs, then they're going to deteriorate really fast and they're going to die rapidly if they get no oxygen. So when we look at that, the things we need are actually a bit of first aid skill. It's not equipment, it's not bits of gear, it's actually some first aid skill for that. And I'd highly recommend going on a decent first aid course and learning some airway skills. And I will do a video about some basic first aid skills as we go on, because I think it'd be really useful to cover the airway skills, because they're actually fairly simple, but if you do the basics well, this is what saves lives. And I've had to do this before when I've not had much equipment. I've had a seriously head injured patient in the middle of nowhere, and we've had an hour's transfer to the nearest hospital, and we've had to control their airway using very, very simple techniques that actually anybody can do. And if you practice them and you're confident, that's what's going to save a life, by getting oxygen into that person if they're trying to breathe. The second thing is lack of blood. Now, it's a bit rarer to get massive hemorrhage. Everybody loves their tourniquets and all these things to stop bleeding, but actually penetrating or catastrophic hemorrhage in a motorcycle accident is relatively rare, especially if we're wearing armoured gear. You know, the chance of something going into us is relatively slim, and also the chances of us having a true amputation, especially riding off-road, is relatively low. We're a lot more likely to get nasty fractures and sort of injuries inside us from blunt force trauma rather than other things. So, yes, we can carry the tourniquets, yes, we can carry the stopping bleeding gear, but actually we're probably not going to use that very often. It's going to be more superficial injuries that we need to control the bleeding on, and actually that's not going to be life-threatening. So the main life-threatening hemorrhages are things that are coming from a limb where you can see the blood pumping out all over the floor and it's going rapidly and the person is becoming unconscious in front of your eyes. That's when you need to approach the bleeding immediately and first. So if we go back to the CABC approach that we've always used in medicine, what we do now, and this has come from a military background now with the C put on the beginning of the ABC, is that the C is for catastrophic hemorrhage, and that really is massive hemorrhage where you just know it's all going to go wrong if you don't control it immediately. And if you've got that, you do that before the airway. There's no point rescuing the airway if somebody's bleeding out and they're not going to have any blood to transport that oxygen. But like I said, that's relatively rare in motorbike injuries, and it's a slightly longer process of that bleeding out unless you've got internal injuries, which we can't actually do a huge amount about apart from get somebody to a hospital, definitive care really rapidly. So bleeding will cause death and it will cause it rapidly, but the usual type of bleeding that we see in this sort of environment isn't going to be that type of bleeding. We then come on to time critical injuries and actually time critical illnesses. So cardiac chest pain could be a time critical illness where we need to get somebody into hospital within about 4 hours if we can. And then we've got the time critical injuries. So if we've got internal injuries and they're relatively stable, so if somebody's had blunt force trauma to their chest, to their abdomen, to their pelvis, you're going to bleed inside, or there's potential to bleed inside. And those are the things we can't do an awful lot about. We can't compress it, we can't put bandages on it, we can't put a tourniquet on it, and that bleeding is going to continue whatever we do. So a big part of this is recognising the mechanism of injury. What's happened when somebody's come off their bike? Did you see it? Did they go over? Did they hit things on the way? How quickly were they going? What's that mechanism and what's the energy transfer to the body? If you're going along at 15 miles an hour and you just fall off sideways, it's very unlikely that you're going to have any internal injuries that are going to cause any significant harm. Whereas if you're doing 40 miles an hour up a fire road and you come off and you hit a tree, then the changes in energy and the forces involved will put you at far higher risk of quite significant injury inside. So if you're unlucky enough to see something like this, really look at the scene and really look at what's gone on and think, what could be wrong with this person? It's always going to be an urgent response anyway. You're going to be really worried if somebody comes off their bike. You're going to be really anxious that they've really injured themselves badly. But if you just give yourself 10-15 seconds to assess the scene and assess what's just happened, it'll put your head in a far better place to plan what you're going to do in terms of looking after and getting that person out. I like to use a system before calling the emergency services. It's really easy to just have a massive brain fart when you're trying to get through to emergency services, and getting the information through is really hard sometimes if we're really wound up, really highly aroused and almost panicking sometimes because what we're seeing is really unpleasant. So just dial your brain back a bit, get a Sharpie pen, and always carry a Sharpie pen, they're invaluable, and write it down somewhere. Write down what you're going to say to them, because that will save you time when you come to talk to them. Now, what we do is use a system called ATMIS. So once we've given the exact location, we go on to this ATMIST acronym. And we use this in pre-hospital care to pre-alert a hospital about a patient. But it's a really nice construct to be able to use for giving information to emergency services. So the A is the age and the patient. It's who are they, how old are they male or female? The T is the time of the injury, and that's quite important. When we're looking at time critical injuries, the time is relevant to the type of care and transport that might be mobilised for this. So the time of the injury is very important. The M is the mechanism, so what's happened. We've got a motorcyclist here who's come off at 40 miles an hour. They've hit a tree as they've decelerated. I think they're pretty unwell. So the mechanism of that injury. Now we come on to I, which is where you explain the injuries. So they've got pain in their neck, they're having trouble breathing, and I think they've fractured their femur and their ankle's facing the wrong way. So a summary of the injuries, because again, that will give information to the emergency services about who needs to come out for this patient, what needs to happen, and also, more importantly, where do they need to go? What facility do they need to go? Can they go by ground ambulance to the nearest hospital? Or is there enough trauma there that they'd send an aircraft to actually take somebody to a regional trauma centre? So it's really important to get those injuries across. The S is the symptoms and signs. So it could be, they're in severe pain, they're a bit confused, they look clammy, they're pale. Anything, just observe. You don't have to be medical about this. It's just what you can see. And I think we can, even if we're not medically trained, we can see whether somebody is really unwell in front of us. So describe what you see when you're saying the symptoms and signs. And then the T is the type of treatment that you've given. So what have you done so far? So I've put dressings on all the wounds, I've stabilised their neck, and I've put a splint on the leg. So it's just a rough summary of the treatment you've given to that patient. So ATMIST is really useful. There are lots of different acronyms, but choose one and rehearse it in your head and get that mental model, because when it does happen, it's really valuable to have that in your head. Okay, so it's time to have a look what I actually carry. So let's have a look what's in my bag. Now, I break it down into different bags and we can take varying amounts each time, but I'll show you what I carry sort of roughly most of the time. Right, let's open the bag and see what's in here. So I divide it down into bags, and the first one I've got is just my basic first aid kit. So this is the thing for minor stuff, but I also carry my protective gear in here as well. So if we look in it, it's not got very much. It's really not got very much. It's got that Sharpie pen that I spoke about and just some tape, which is always useful, but it's really quite empty. But the important things are, I've got some decent scissors. These are always super valuable. Now, I'm not sponsored by anyone, I don't get given any of this, but these are Leatherman Raptors, and they are the best scissors you'll ever get. They are just absolutely amazing, but they're just great the rest of the time as well. They're great for cable ties. They're just really strong, sharp scissors, so they are really well worth getting if you want to have a decent pair of scissors in your first aid kit. In this pouch here, I've got my protective gear. So in this one, I just carry some gloves. Always wear gloves, and I've just got a couple of fluid resistant surgical masks. We don't know what's happening with COVID or splash, or even just splashes in the face. There's lots of stuff that can cause us trouble, so I do carry a couple of masks in there. And then in this compartment, I've just got a selection of, got one medium dressing, that's an ambulance dressing, and that's just a big padded dressing which we can use. I do carry a foil blanket. Now, I really don't like these very much because people use them in the wrong way and for the wrong reasons. What they're great for is to use as a vapour barrier. So they won't get you warm, they won't warm you back up, but what they will do is, if you've had to cut somebody's clothing off to get to injuries, what you need to do is pad them up again with insulation and then put this over the top, especially if they're wet, because that will act as a vapour barrier and it will stop evaporation. So I think there is a role for those, the foil blankets. They're very small, they're very light, so actually there's no harm in carrying one of those. I've got a funky little hat. So this is a Blizzard adult beanie hat. And again, we lose loads of heat through our head. So if you're in the middle of nowhere and you're waiting for the emergency services to arrive, it doesn't look cool, but actually it is really useful in terms of keeping people warm. Another useful thing is little saline pods. So just saline water, and these are great for eyes. If people get grit or a bit of gunk in their eye, you just click one of these and you can rinse out somebody's eye. So quite useful in the first aid section of that. I carry a disposable scalpel just because there's billions of uses for that. It's like a Sharpie pen. You've got a Sharpie pen and a disposable scalpel. You can do loads of things. And then the rest of it, I've just really got a selection of plasters and small dressings in there, and some simple first aid, pain-killing tablets. So there's not a huge amount in that bag, but that's my sort of go-to bag for simple stuff. And the bag I go to, I think, oh my god, the shit's hit the fan, I need some protection, and get that out. Okay, so the next thing in the bag, a lot of people might not carry this, but I just carry a little Airway helper bag. So these are things that I can use to simply improve somebody's airway, and I keep it blue. Blue is Airway by convention, and in here I've got a couple of the bendy airways, so the oropharyngeal airways, which go in the mouth down the back, and they're really useful if you've got a head injured person and they're obstructing their airway because they're unconscious. If they tolerate these are really good for keeping that airway open. Get some training before you use these. There is a technique to putting them in. It's fairly simple, but you will learn this on a decent first aid course. Next thing I carry is nasopharyngeal airways. Now again, you need a bit more training to do these. They're still relatively simple, but you should do some proper training to use these. And these go in through the nose to the back of the throat. And ideally you'd put one in each nostril if somebody was obstructing their airway. But these can stop you having to have somebody holding the airway all the time. And then I said penetrating injury is really rare. I carry a chest seal in case somebody has a penetrating chest injury. I think that's very unlikely, but it's very lightweight, doesn't take up much room, so it's just a spare one I had, so I do carry that. So that's all I've got in that extra bag really. The only other thing which dropped was a little face barrier, so a guard for doing mouth-to-mouth ventilations. Now, if you do have a cardiac arrest in the middle of nowhere, it's unfortunately pretty bad news. The chances of recovering from it, unless you get very rapid medical intervention, are pretty slim, especially if it's a traumatic cardiac arrest. But if somebody's just struggling to breathe, or they've got a head injury and they're not breathing fast enough and you need to just help their breathing, it's quite nice just to have a barrier to put over somebody's mouth so you can assist their ventilation or give them mouth-to-mouth ventilations if you need to. So that's all I've got in my airway kit. It's not a lot. I could carry a lot more, but there's just no point, and it just adds weight and takes up space. And my final important bag is my trauma bag. So it's a little bit bigger, and most things in here you can carry if you've got no medical training. So we'll have a little look in this. And so this is the one I get out if the shit hits the fan and it's all going wrong and there's been a really horrible thing happened. This is the bag that I want. So in here I've got some goggles, so if things are sort of bleeding, if they're spurting, if you're managing difficult airways, it's very good to keep bodily fluids and blood out of your eyes and your mouth and your nose. So this just protects the eyes quite nicely, and if you've got a mask, that'll protect everything else. I carry 2 of these large combat dressings. These are superb. These are supplied by Prometheus. It's a blast bandage, and I've used these a lot. They're great. You can put them anywhere. Just practice with one if you can get hold of one. And these are just huge pads with a lot of bandage to compress any wounds. So I carry 2 of those. Pretty useful. And then I also carry some hemostatic gauze as well. So this is stuff that if you've got a really severely bleeding wound, let's say you up here in an artery, or you've got an arterial bleed down here and it's really not stopping with compression, you can keep the compression on, you can try a tourniquet, but also this you can pack the wound with and it will help the clotting in that wound. Again, you might need some training for that because it does need a little bit of thought about how you use it, but it can be useful if you're going more off the beaten track and think you might get some different injuries. I've got a larger trauma dressing. So in this I've got 3 major dressings, and usually I've not had to use many more than that, so that's a good number and that will cope with most things. Got a roll of elastic sticky bandage. Now if you've got duct tape, that's just as useful. Duct tape is infinitely useful for medicine, but this is just elastic bandage for compressing dressings more, putting splints on. Very useful, but duct tape is just as good. Now here's the dreaded combat application tourniquet. They're great, but you probably won't need to use one. One time you can consider it. So I've been to road traffic collisions where somebody's had a lot of injuries on their leg, and it's not been a catastrophic bleed, but over time all these wounds which you can't stop the bleeding on have been letting loads of blood out. And so we can use tourniquets on that type of injury. If there's a lot of bleeding from lots of different sites and you can get a tourniquet on proximally to it, so higher up, then it can be useful. but you should be trying all other methods to stop bleeding before sticking a tourniquet on, unless it is true catastrophic hemorrhage. So lots of controversy about tourniquets. They do have their place. They are super useful in certain types of injury, but just be very careful about using those. And then the final thing I've got is a SAM splint. These are great. They're super lightweight. They're aluminium with foam around it, so it's an aluminium sheet. And actually what I'll do, I'll take this one out for you and we'll have a look at it. This is a new one, and what it is just an aluminium sheet which is bendy, and if you look at that, you can just form it into so many things for splints. So, you know, if you're looking at wrists, you can cut some off, so it cuts really easily with the scissors. You can form a wrist splint into the hand. You can fold it over the end to go into the hand, shape it in like that, and then you can splint a forearm, so splint a wrist. And these are great. You can do the whole arm with them as well. You can just get really creative with those. Think about the structure, think about the angles, and think about what's going to give that support. But a SAM splint is really useful because when you splint fractures, they get less painful. It reduces the pain of fractures. So I think those are really useful. They're super lightweight. Carry them everywhere. You stick them in the back of a rucksack if you want, just down the back. But I love those. So well worth a look. The thing I did want to mention was the cold again. So I said at the beginning that cold is really bad for trauma and also for medical conditions as well. If we get acid blood, if we're not breathing very well and we're cold, we've got this triangle of stuff that makes things go really bad for us. So in the winter, I would carry a heated blanket. This is a Blizzard heated blanket, and these are superb, especially if you get somebody off the ground and insulate them, and if you can get them sheltered as well. So if you've got a tent with you, get the tent up over the person. And then these heated blankets are great. So you put them over a single layer, so the person should be wearing a layer of some sort, but quite a thin one. You put that over the top, and then you put your insulating layers over the top of that. And then if you are outside, make sure you put that vapor barrier, so the waterproof layer over the top of everything to insulate that patient. So I think if you are going to cold environments and there is a risk of injury and somebody being stranded, I think that is well worth having. So I hope you've found that useful. It's just my take on first aid in remote environments, and I've been doing this for a lot of years and teaching it as well. So teaching medics and clinicians how to do medicine in remote places. And the big thing is to get that mental model, to pre-think how you're going to approach any scenario. Think about where you are, think about the evacuation resources and how you're going to deal with a potential injury. And then think really hard about what you're going to carry. Don't carry too much, and make sure what you do carry is useful and you're trained how to use it. So have a look at what you can find, have a look at how you build your first aid kit. I'm very happy to answer any queries or questions. I'm sure there'll be people who disagree with what I say. There always are, you know, we're all got different opinions, but very happy to open the discussion on this. So once again, thanks for watching, really appreciate your time. Be lovely if you'd subscribe to the channel, and I'll be back with the next film very soon. So ride safe, have your mini adventures, and have fun. See you.